Welcome to DocPod. Hear health.
Welcome to DocPod. I'm here with Dr. Alaina Rajagopal, who is a board-certified emergency medicine physician, holds a PhD in public health, virology, and space life sciences, has conducted research in various areas, including aerospace medicine, space life sciences, and paleontology, among others. Is also a part-time faculty member in the electrical engineering department at Caltech, and is an emergency medicine physician at Kaiser Permanente. But I think maybe most importantly, and we're going to touch on this today in our conversation, is the co-founder and chief medical officer of Esperto Medical, which is enabling medical diagnostics remotely, and the tagline is whether in your home, the peak of Mount Everest, or the surface of Mars. So welcome to the show. Thanks for having me in your life and on your calendar, and giving us a little bit of your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk to you today.
It is my pleasure. So I know I just gave a bit of a long-winded intro, but if you could talk to me a little bit about who you are, what you do, maybe elevator pitch, and push all the buttons all the way to the top.
Sure. I mean, where do you want me to start? It's a long history at this point. But basically, I am an emergency medicine physician by training. Before going into emergency medicine, I worked primarily in aerospace research, but also kind of dabbled in, as you mentioned, paleontology and conservation biology and some other biologic sciences as well. So I did my PhD in public health, virology, and space life sciences, and was specifically researching why Epstein-Barr virus reactivates during spaceflight. And so basically what that means is we know that Epstein-Barr virus is sort of latent in our cells, and it reactivates, or it sort of wakes up when people go to space. And so I was looking at microgravity and radiation as possible causes for why that happens. After that, went to medical school, did a residency in emergency medicine, and so have continued my interest in aerospace and austere environments in general. So with wilderness medicine, aerospace medicine, and global health, anything that's sort of atypical working environments, I guess. So it was those interests that sort of led me to medical diagnostics, because working in those environments, you don't have a lot of tools available to you. And so I started talking to my co-founder, who's also my husband, who's an electrical engineer and physicist, about ways that we could improve medical diagnostics for use in remote locations, which also fortunately applies to urban centers, or, a regular hospital environment or home environment as well. And so we started working on ultrasound as a way that we could make sort of a more accessible diagnostic tool for people in these remote environments. And that ultimately led us to blood pressure, which we thought would be a, quote, easy first problem to solve. It ended up being a little more challenging. I would say we failed a couple of times, threw away a couple of methods before we finally kind of developed resonance sonomanometry. But it's been a really interesting journey and a really fulfilling career so far.
That's amazing. And so resonance sonomanometry is your and your husband's invention, or at least a form thereof. Is that correct?
Yeah. We developed it out of our lab at Caltech.
Amazing. And I did a little bit of research into it. And the most interesting part to me, I play guitar. And so I was looking at some of the analogies made. And I would love for you to explain exactly what it is, what it does, and how it's helpful as a non-invasive procedure. But the tuning of a guitar string, as you turn the key, it gets tighter. There is more tension applied, but that is proportionately, or is proportionate to the amount of tension on the string divided by the square root. Exactly. I think did I get that math correctly?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So we basically use an audio frequency stimulus through something like a bone conduction headphone. And so that bone conduction headphone directs sound directly into the skin, and that sound creates a resonance in the wall of the artery, similar to the guitar string that you were describing. And so that resonance tone is directly related to the tension in the wall of the artery, or the arterial stiffness. And so with ultrasound, we're able to look and measure the arterial radius, the arterial wall thickness. And with those key parameters, we're able to actually directly calculate blood pressure about 100 times a second. So it's a continuous measurement. We get a really high fidelity waveform. So it's essentially data equivalent to an arterial catheter, which is an invasive device that's a needle that you stick into somebody's artery, leave the catheter in there, and that connects to like a pressurized tube so you can get that pressure. So we're able to get really high quality data that's really only been available in critical care units and surgical suites in the past. And so this method is really exciting because it allows for that level of measurement, but non-invasively. So it could be used anywhere, like some of the places we've described.
Right. And as you mentioned, the catheter is really only used in critical care or emergency rooms or places that are either not convenient to be, of course, for whatever reason, or to be able to use that method for measurement. So it sounds like the implications and the application of it is unbelievably widespread, as you mentioned, in some of the areas you talked about in wilderness medicine. You can go to space and use it. But seems like it would be a lot more convenient way for physicians to get an accurate data-driven blood pressure gauge as opposed to the inflatable cuff that everybody hates. And it's just kind of annoying. And there's one in CVS and you have to sit there and it sounds like a machine gun. So yeah.
I think as an ER doctor, that's one of the first three questions I usually get from patients and family members is, when do I get to leave? When can I take this blood pressure cuff off? And when can the IV come out? So those are definitely not popular, I would say, among people using them. And so this is something that's cuffless. It doesn't squeeze your arm at all. And the sensation, you kind of don't notice it, but when we first put it on, it feels maybe like a phone buzzer or something like that. So it's pretty benign, I think, compared to completely occluding your artery or sticking a needle in your artery.
Absolutely. I want to know what was the why behind it. And I know that just application wise, I could give 20 answers of it, but what was yours to say, well, here's a problem. There's got to be a better way.
Yeah, I think my co-founders and I would probably have slightly different whys, but I can tell you at least mine. So, as I mentioned, I was working in a lot of these remote environments that are really challenging, and you don't have a lot of information that you can use to help treat your patients in those environments. And so I wanted to find a better way to get information about patients that helps me provide higher quality care in some of these remote environments, because there's definitely a different standard in what I could provide to patients, on a remote island in the Philippines versus what I can do for my patients here in Los Angeles. Right. And so it really was focused on just wanting to improve diagnostics in general. And so the sort of key point for me, I remember talking to Aditya, my co-founder, and saying, I really wish I just had a tricorder. And I don't know if you're familiar with Star Trek at all, but it's this magical device that you just wave over a patient and that tells you what's wrong. And
it's like an old flip phone almost.
Exactly. Yeah. And his thought was, well, why don't we just build one? It's obviously, nobody's thought of that. Why not?
So yours was convenience and being in remote areas, being able to get data from patients for blood pressure. His was Star Trek.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's an example of science fiction sort of becoming science fact, where it was something that existed in a movie, and it was something that we could use that as an example to try to adapt existing technologies to get closer to that endpoint. So we're not quite to tricorder yet, but at least improving blood pressure for now. Yeah.
I mean, the next iteration, your husband is, I mentioned, an electrical engineer and a physicist. I'm fairly certain that within the next 5 years, you can get the unbreakable Nokia phone meets the tricorder. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Meets resonance tonometry. And then, I'm excited to have one in my pocket and see what's going on with me all day, every day.
We're really excited about that too. I keep asking when I can take my own device home and start wearing it all the time.
And so is it portable or is it attached to a larger machine? What's the kind of size scope?
So the first device, the first product that we're intending to release will be a wearable device that fits over the brachial artery. So kind of like right here on the arm. Similarly placed to a blood pressure cuff, but again, not squeezing. It'll have the capability to operate on battery power for shorter periods of time, probably somewhere between 6 and 24 hours, depending on how frequently measurements are being taken. And then beyond that, sort of working in the hospital, it'll just plug into existing monitors at the hospital. So really kind of like seamless integration with existing systems and equipment.
This is amazing. Is there like the back end technology? Would there be an app for that? And then within the hospital, it plugs right into what, an EMR and or some sort of a, I don't know, data reader that it can translate that data? Or
that's kind of the goal would be to have it integrate seamlessly with EMR, to have sort of like a cloud-based system where patients at home can have their data just automatically uploaded, shared with their doctor. And I think this really is important for patients in particular who experience things like white coat hypertension, where their blood pressure goes up the second they walk into their doctor's office. And I mean, it's a stressful experience. You've got to find parking and, find the doctor's office. There's probably traffic, running late. So people's blood pressure is usually high when they get to the doctor's office. And that's usually when it's taken,
right.
When you first get there and are really stressed out. And so there's a lot of evidence that people have these artificially high blood pressures. And so if we're able to continuously take someone's blood pressure at home, we can better understand, are they experiencing hypertension from stress, from walking into the doctor's office, or are they actually normally normotensive? And that's just, one point in time. And the other, I think, really interesting application for that is for patients who are on blood pressure medications. A lot of times in the emergency room, we'll have patients come in and have an overly high blood pressure in the morning or an overly low blood pressure later in the day. And so having that data continuously on a day-to-day basis will really help physicians design better medication regimens for those patients so that they're not experiencing hypertension at one point and hypotension at another point, and, really getting that dialed in better.
Well, that sounds invaluable to any physician, maybe actually any patient, because, as you mentioned, you're going to get abnormal readings at different times of the day, especially if you're coming out of a meeting, or if you're just woken up in the morning, or if you're 25 as opposed to, 75, even so. And, and all of the different life experiences that surround those people at different ages, different times of life. So it's continuous data that's being fed into whatever that may be that the physician can read, is going to have to help with diagnoses, treatment, preventative care, and missed diagnoses probably too, because if you're reading the data from someone that just came in, as you mentioned, in whatever situation it was, they walk off the street and they just hate going to the doctor. And then all of a sudden that cuff comes off and it's like, whoa, hey, what happened? And so, being able to look back at the last week when you weren't in front of the white coat for the white coat hypertension is going to be something, I think it will save lives, definitely, but make people's lives a lot more livable.
Yeah, absolutely. We're sort of incorrectly diagnosing hypertension or missing hypertension in many, many patients. I think the statistic was around 40%. And so that's massive. And, it's because we really see patients only at doctor's visits. And then, you can ask a patient to take their blood pressure at home, write it down, but, life happens. That's really hard for people to do, to sit down when, they have 2 or 3 kids in the morning to take their morning blood pressure when they're trying to get everybody out the door and school and, at work. It's really hard to stop and say, hang on, I got to take my blood pressure real quick. So having a device that's just on, that they don't have to worry about and can seamlessly transmit that to their doctor, I think will make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm one of those people as well. I had, I don't even want to say moderately, but just a skosh higher than what my doctor wanted as far as blood pressure is concerned. So I went on Amazon, I bought a cuff, and he said, take it in the morning when you wake up, if you can, mid-afternoon and then evening, and then, give me the readings. And that lasted for about a week.
Yeah.
And it's not because I'm not regimented, but even so,
Right.
as you mentioned, life happens. There's kids,
Yeah.
there's a breakfast to cook, and then there's work to do, and all of these other things. And so, just it's still sitting next to my bed and unused
Right.
for a couple of months. So that type of convenience, where it's not something you actually have to actively do,
Yeah.
will be able to. I mean, I'd buy it.
Awesome. Great. We've got a customer.
Sold. I'll be the beta test.
I would say too, you mentioned age earlier, and that's a really interesting challenge. So there are a lot of non-invasive continuous devices that are starting to be developed using optical methods, like photoplethysmography, for example. And so one of the things that doesn't really take into account is arterial stiffness. And as we age, our arteries tend to get stiffer. And so one of the really cool things about resonance sonomanometry is that we actually measure the stiffness because we're taking that tension measurement in the wall of the artery. And so I think that's a really, really interesting metric that we've never really looked at continuously, or how that changes throughout the day. I think that's a really interesting area for more research and more potential clinical application in the future, that could have a lot of bearing on what types of medications different patients need to use.
Oh, I'm certain of that. And I feel like I knew that, right? It's like, oh, I mentioned that because I was thinking about it, and that was definitely on my mind. But no, it was off the cuff. But you're absolutely right, and they do harden or get stiffer as we get older, and so your readings are going to be off, right? If it's the same device that you're using for an 18-year-old as you are an 80-year-old,
Right.
and maybe not the reading, but what the treatment may be for whatever that symptom that person may have. This is incredible. I'm really excited to see what comes of this, and as you continue to develop it. Switching gears here a little bit into space life sciences.
Yeah.
I am incredibly curious as to A, what that is, but B, applications in what you're doing potentially with this or other things, and or in our lives just as everyday humans. So tell me a little bit about that research and what it is.
Yeah, this is really exciting for me. It's kind of my passion since I was a little kid. I've always been really interested in space and space research. And so space life sciences is basically the study of organisms in space, whether that's a human or a plant or other biological organisms. And so it's something that I think has definitely enabled better medical treatment and better attention to sort of how a human integrates with the spaceflight environment. But to your point, it's also really benefited humans on Earth with a lot of research and a lot of inventions that have come out of some of the research that's been done in spaceflight. So like I said before, my particular research was focused on virology and microbiology. So really understanding how humans and microorganisms interact in the spaceflight environment and how the environment itself kind of changes that interaction in people and viruses. And so that was really interesting. And yeah, I feel like there's so much more work that I'd love to do on that. But
so basically, just you have a PhD in like a Marvel movie, in Venom,
Yeah.
or I don't know, what was that called? Event Horizon. But as you're talking about what researching organisms as they interact with humans from space, etc. That's all I can think of is exactly that. But I know that's completely far fetched. But you just mentioned Star Trek is now coming to life with your invention. So. So I know that, as humans go into space flight for a long period of time, the body changes, just the physicality of it. So there's bone density loss, there's muscle loss, there's atrophy, all of these other things. And you have to basically rehab if you're there for too long. So is that part of this? Or is it, you mentioned just organisms in their interaction, or is it also, you did research in paleontology. So the history of humankind, once we got into space, that changed quite a bit. So talk to me a little bit about maybe the day-to-day application of some of your research, or some of the things that it applies to, in general, if you can.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. All of the bone density loss, the muscle mass loss, all kind of plays into that space life sciences field. And so that also includes cardiovascular physiology. Obviously, I'm interested in that as well. And so it's really interesting basically your body has been pumping blood up to your brain against gravity for all of our evolution, all of humanity's existence. And so when we launch people into space, the body doesn't quite know what to do with that. And so it keeps kind of pumping blood up. And so you notice astronauts actually get this sort of puffy face, chicken leg syndrome is what it's called, because that fluid starts to sort of gather in the head. And that lasts like 2 to 3 days before the pressure receptors in your blood vessels start to recognize, hey, there's too much fluid here, and they cause a diuresis. So you end up peeing out some of the fluid. So you reach sort of a new homeostasis in space. But then when astronauts come back to Earth, there's another problem, because then they don't have enough fluid to pump everything up to their brain. And so there's a new phenomenon that occurs when they stand too quickly or sort of lock their legs, stand for too long after landing. It can cause orthostatic syncope, or basically passing out from not having enough fluid pumping up to your brain. Your brain says there's not enough blood here and causes you to kind of hit the ground to level that out. So we've been able to learn a lot about human physiology on Earth by exposing humans to a new environment that they've never experienced before, in millennia of development. So that's really exciting and really cool.
And for someone who's not going to go to space, unless Elon really fast forwards this plan to get commercial space flight in the next 10 to 20 years, what's the practical application for somebody like myself? Not maybe specifically, but any, Tom, Dick, or Harry that is just walking around. So how does that study, or how does that information apply to us here on Earth if we're not going to space?
Yeah, so I think as a researcher, it gets me thinking about things differently than I would if I were just thinking about my patients in the hospital. And it has me designing experiments differently where, in exposing people to those environments, I might want to use multiple devices and say, let's put a device on somebody's carotid artery in the neck, and let's put another device on their femoral artery in their leg, and see how that fluid shift sort of changes in a modeled spaceflight environment or a parabolic flight or something like that. And each of those experiments then teaches us new things about how the body reacts to different stressors. And so we can then take that research about how the body's reacting to stressors in space and apply that to how humans react to stressors on Earth. So for viral reactivation, for example, probably not a huge deal in the long term. Most people experience viral reactivation, periodically due to psychological stress on Earth. But in space, that could potentially be more of a challenge because of radiation and modeled microgravity. And so while it's not something we would necessarily treat on Earth, it's something we might think about treating in space. And so if we're working on developing those therapies for people in space, we can then take those therapies and apply them to people on Earth, so that maybe it wasn't a big deal they were having that viral reactivation. Maybe, there was a little more inflammation than they needed in their body at the time, but we can use those treatments now and say, if you're experiencing these symptoms or having increased levels of fatigue or something like that, you can use things like this. So there's a lot of ways it applies, and a lot of inventions that have come from spaceflight.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you're just basically just removing yourself from a vacuum. You're giving a new perspective, a fresh set of eyes, but different environments. And that application, as you mentioned, you may put, and I can't remember what you mentioned, but on a carotid artery as well as a femoral, just to see what happens and where that fluid is coming from and going to. You or maybe anyone wouldn't have thought to do that otherwise without that type of a research. And it's not going to hurt. It can only help. But again, it's just, hey, let's try this because I've seen it in space and maybe something's happening here we don't know about. So kind of eliminating the need for the Dr. House, because you're just doing all of these things in general as the research progresses.
Yeah. And I think it's something too that when you have any sort of challenge or research question that comes up, it makes you think about problems differently. And when you think about problems differently, you also think about different solutions. And so through that, it's really, really, I think, invaluable to humans on Earth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like I've got another hour and a half to speak with you about space travel, space radiology exposure, and fluid dispersion amongst human bodies as they travel back and forth. But want to maybe save that for another episode. But I want to thank you for your time, Dr. Rajagopal. It has been eye-opening and a pleasure. And I'm going to go do some more research on some of these things. And I'm excited to see your product come out first, second, third, fifth iteration and how it changes the medical landscape. So thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun to talk about. I love talking about this stuff. So anytime.